It was just it was a different town. Things went at a slower pace. I remember things that appealed to me particularly as a child. Um, we loved to see the delivery wagons come through the neighborhood. The Clover Creamery, their wagon was pulled by a horse. The ice wagon was pulled by a horse. And every now and then we would snitch little pieces of ice off the bed of the truck to refresh ourselves on hot summer days. It was a different world. And the horses, we loved the horses. In summertime, they wore straw hats with their ears cut out, so their ears poked through, and they were shaded a little bit from the heat as they made their rounds. I liked the Clover Creamery horse because he was especially well trained. The Clover Creamery man would get off the wagon with a wire basket with so many quarts of milk and whatever else he thought was needed by the next few customers down the street. The horse and the wagon stayed fixed, but the milkman went from house to house. Sometimes he'd find a note in a bottle, leave an extra quart of this or whatever, and he would, but sometimes he didn't have it in his hand. And so then he would whistle, and the horse would move from where it had been stationed down 2 or 3 houses to where the milkman was, and he could get the item that he needed for that particular customer. And then thereafter, the horse stayed in the same place until the milkman whistled again for him to come forward. They worked together, and it was quite interesting to watch. And of course, as children, we were all in love with the horses. We thought they were the greatest thing ever. The streetcars were were interesting. Well, we called it a trolley. The car was like a big bus, and on the rear end of the bus was this trolley, which was a big pole with a pulley, a wheel, a grooved wheel on the end of it, and a rope. The motorman had to center that on the wire that went down overhead, followed the streetcar tracks in the middle of the track overhead. And that trolley had to be grooved against that wire to pick up the electricity to operate the motors in the streetcar. And when the motorman got to the end of his line, he had to pull that trolley down and tether it in a lower position and go to the other end of the car and raise the trolley on that end so the car could now reverse its motion and move in the opposite direction. So it was really quite a complex thing. And inside, all the streetcar seats had a hinge on the back of them. And when you got to the end of the line, you changed the direction of the seat. You didn't turn it around, you just moved the back from one side over to the other. So instead of facing this way as the streetcar went down the avenue, you were now facing this way because the back for the seat had been reversed. My sister lived at Buena Vista Avenue in Southeast, and that was in the mill area where the silk mills were. They had a dormitory for women to live in a more or less protected environment while they were away from home and working for a living. In cold weather, sometimes I'd go down to Southeast and I would help my sister for a Saturday afternoon because she at that time was raising 3 children and she had her hands full, and even more so when she got the 4th. It was so funny. I would ride the streetcar down to Southeast, go down Lower Buena Vista Avenue where my sister lived, spend the day with her, and then I'd leave to ride the streetcar home at night. I'd go back up the hill on Buena Vista Avenue to 9th Street, which was the avenue that went to the silk mill. In the wintertime, when it was cold, the motorman would let me catch the streetcar on its outbound trip so that I could stay out of the weather and ride the warm car to the end of the line and then come on back with him for my return trip home. It was cold, and I appreciated the warmth, not having very many garments that were protected from the cold, because we were not well off. We were pretty having a hard time economically. It was an education to ride the streetcar, because on the outbound ride, the motorman would pick me up and I would ride to the end of the line. Guess what happened then? The shift change at the mill had taken place, and the streetcar was full of young ladies on their return home. And I learned a whole new vocabulary that I couldn't use at home. But I must say it was an education. I was not really too much aware of it. I knew we eked along, managed somehow. My father had a diminishing income. He was an insurance agent. And for every insurance policy that is sold, for so many years following the date of that sale, Dad would receive a percentage of the amount of premium that was paid year by year for, we'll say, 10 years. But the premium diminished. And by the time you got to the 10th year, the percentage was virtually nil. My father lived through that. He was able to have some income, but of course it was diminishing all the time, because in those hard years, he wasn't selling new insurance. Nobody could afford it. And he worked for an old line company, the Penn Mutual Life Insurance Company, located at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Their slogan was, "Back of your independence stands the Penn Mutual." Sounds very reassuring. Yeah. Only my father had insurance with them, and during the Depression years, he cashed it in because he was trying to stay afloat economically. And all his best efforts were to naught. Nothing worked. He lost everything he owned. I was sent to New York to live with my mother's first cousin, who was married and had a son 2.5 years younger than me. And we got along well. I never knew why I was sent there. I thought I had done something, misbehaved in some way that they didn't approve of, and they were getting rid of me. So that black cloud hung over my head for years, full of wonder. And it wasn't until years later that my older sister told me in some conversation we had, Mildred, my older sister, stayed at home, and she helped me provide for Mother and Dad in the house that I had bought. I bought it because we needed a place to stay. And in the Depression, we had no automobile, and if we had to move, it was going to be like a $300 cost. And we didn't have that kind of money. So I used my privilege after the war. I was in World War II. I used my privilege to make a loan, and I bought the house in which we lived until my mom and dad died in my home. My sister Mildred moved with me. She loved the guy that she was dating, but she didn't love him enough to marry him. And she told me, I said, "Why not you?" She said, "Well, I love so-and-so more than anybody I've ever known, but I don't love him enough to marry him." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because he has a compulsion to be the center of every crowd that he's with. He's got to dominate everything." And she said it gets a little heavy at times to deal with that. And she never did marry him. She loved him dearly. If you're confused, the years are all mixed up here, you know.
That's all right.
And I am too. I'll put the calendar in order. I lived with this family in New York for 4 years. I lived there 2 years and was permitted to come home on vacation. Where they got the money to do that, I don't know. But anyway, they did. And I had a break at home. And then, horror of horrors, I was packaged up again and sent on the train back to New York to stay longer. And I was in tears on that return journey, because that's not what I wanted. I couldn't visualize spending my life in New York. I wanted to be with my family. It just wasn't the same. It wasn't as emotionally fulfilling. I started to explain that it was not until years later that my sister Mildred told me in a conversation we were having. She said, "You resented having to go to New York, but you don't know how lucky you were." What do you mean? We had it hard. We were living without many of the things that we needed, and you were spared that because you were living in New York. I had not thought that I was lucky to be there, but I was. Over years, that family loved me and I loved them, and I spent many a vacation with them. Every fall of the year, I'd go to New York and enjoy a week with this family that I had lived with before. They always welcomed me. They wanted me to stay with them, and I couldn't do that. When I finished my 4-year term, I was ready to come back to Roanoke and go into high school and get on with my life, whatever it was going to be. I went to work after I got out of high school. I graduated at 17 because I was a September baby. And I couldn't get a job until I was 18 because corporations couldn't legally hire me until I was of that age, 18. So I had to waste a summer before I could get a job. And then the day that I was given an interview, while I was at one interview, 2 others called me for two other jobs that I'd applied for, all 3 of them at the same time. I couldn't get a job, and then suddenly one day I'm bombarded with them. And I went to work for the Norfolk and Western Railway Company, which had its headquarters in town. And I went to work at the Messenger, and then I was promoted from Messenger to clerk, and on up to clerk, to clerk typist, to, this is an interesting word, to phonographer. It's not a dirty word. A phonographer, you transcribed dictation that had been transcribed into an Epiphone cylinder, a cylinder about that long and about that thick, made out of hard wax, like a phonograph record. And you put it on a mandrel and inserted the needle and put on the earphones, and you typed exactly what this person said. We had 5 investigators doing that and 3 roadmen who came in on weekends to leave piles of stuff that we had to transcribe. So we had plenty to do. And then as a phonographer, you are promoted to investigator, and instead of transcribing the records, you dictate them, and somebody else does the typing for you. And after being an investigator, I was promoted to an outside job, a free claim adjuster. And I traveled to contact people, the claimants. I traveled offline, off the network for the Norfolk and Western Railway, and I traveled over many other railroads. I spent a lot of time in Chicago, which was good because I got to know the city pretty well. And when my wife and I were married, I took her to Chicago for our honeymoon. We had a great time. I fell in love with music while I was in the Army. There's a room, a building called the day room at an Army post. Every squadron has a day room. You can read, you can relax, you can play games, you can do whatever. This day room had a phonograph. I'll crank it yourself. and an album of records that I didn't know anything about. And I put it on the phonograph and was fascinated to hear the most amazing music I'd ever heard. It was Sergei Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto in D minor, played by Rachmaninoff and the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra. The phonograph record was an old style record. And after you played side one, you had to turn the record over and play side two. Then you went to the next record for sides 3 and 4. Then eventually you'd get through it. You had to do a lot of turning with the records. But believe me, it was worth it to hear Rachmaninoff play because that was the most amazing music I'd ever heard. I should say also that my amazement was compounded by the fact that my mother played the piano, and she played quite well. My wife was a fantastic player, piano and organ. I was used to listening to good music, but I never heard music like that. Nobody I knew played like Rachmaninoff, and that was another trip into heaven. That man's really something special. It just opened up doors for me while I was in Richmond in the Army. After that introduction in the day room, the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra came to Richmond and played at the Mosque Theater. Richmond had a good fare of things that I enjoyed, and I would go to the orchestral productions and to watch somebody play a piano concerto. That's heaven. I lost that finger as a child, so maybe the consensus was that I was never going to learn to play. But I did learn to play. I took lessons on my own when I got to be an adult, and in fact, I was taking lessons when my mother was ill and died, and then I had to quit because there again, more burial expenses. Yeah. The story of my life, debt. I studied from different choir directors. Some of them were quite good. I studied with Jim Blankenship, Marianne Sandborn. I studied with her a couple of summers. The funny thing about music, to me, and this is my conviction, and probably not other, but if you listen to a good singer, to the way that a good singer uses his voice, her voice, you can learn so much about perfecting the technique that you want. And you can practice that. And I did a lot of choir rehearsals through my life. And I sang in a concert choir, and I sang in the Roanoke Valley Choral Society. And we had a wonderful literature of music. When I came back to Roanoke to go to visit my sister who was living in my house while I was in Ohio, my mom and dad had died, and I said, if you can manage the house, I'll keep paying for it because I want to own it. And someday I'll come back to Roanoke, but I'm not sure when. So she decided she could do that. So she stayed in my house and was very comfortable there. When I came in on weekends, I had no church. My church had closed while I was in Ohio, and there was no connection between the two events. It just happened. The congregation died over time. It got smaller and smaller, and it was impossible to bear the debt after a time. So when I came to Roanoke, on weekends, I had no church, and I started going to Huntington Court Methodist Church. And Sally Ann came there as the church organist and music director, and that's where I met her. And when I came back to Roanoke and was transferred here, back home, I needed a church, and I went to Huntington Court Methodist, which incidentally is no longer a Methodist church. It's another denomination of some kind. I don't know what. But I went there, and Sally Ann was, well, I think she was glad to see me. I may have walked into a trap, and I didn't recognize it. She expressed herself quite freely. I have the best of both worlds. I've got a tenor who can sing and read music. She was a great person. Sandra, Kelly, and Cecil, our friends, heard Bill Klein preach, and they recommended him to us. They knew we were searching for a church, and so we came to Second Pres and just had to belong. When we got to Bill Klein, that was the living end. We need nothing, needed nothing more. Dum 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 dum. Jeffrey wouldn't like that pitch. I'm going to wrench my arm out of its socket, patting myself on the back. But I know that Jeffrey and Marianne Sandborg were sincere in begging me not to retire. I retired not because my voice was in trouble, but because I could no longer read the music. With macular degeneration, you got two things you look at. You've got the text for the verse you're singing, and you got the line of notes for the part you're singing, and you combine them just routinely, automatically you do this. But with macular degeneration, that combination doesn't come about so easily. And one of the gentlemen in the choir made big printouts of the choir music that we were singing so that we could see it more easily. But Sally Ann decided she'd like to quit, and I would too, so we quit. But Jeffrey and Marianne Sandborg are two people whose opinion musically I've always respected. Well, I really don't know how to express it. It's just a personal feeling that I have. Well, people need help, and they need it from whatever source it can be provided. And I have given money to a lot of organizations that do things like that. Veterans organizations, the Red Cross, and now Feeding Southwest Virginia. I've been poor. I know what it's like to do without, and it's no fun. It's no fun. The worst part of it is the shame of not being able to do what everybody else is doing, of not being able to provide what everyone else has. And I've been there. My parents went broke. They lost everything they owned in the Depression years. And the house we lived in, where we were born in South Roanoke, Dad lost that. Some property he owned over on Hamilton Terrace, near the hospital. A farm he owned out on Franklin Road. All gone. All gone. And here was a young man who was really going to set the world on fire. And that flame went out pretty quick in the Depression years. And I saw what it did to him, and I know what that did to me. And you've got to help where you can. I'm not begging for credit, but it was a hard life, and I look back on it, and I'm glad to have survived it, because it it was a mess. There were a lot of things I wish that I could have done as a young man, but we didn't have the money for it. My paycheck only went so far, and and that wasn't very far. I wasn't very far at all. It would be missing a ministry that I was comfortable with. Heaven is not only comfortable, but inspired by. You have to have the inspiration to follow it eagerly, willingly. And coupled with that was a good musical ministry provided by two very, very competent musicians. The church was really fortunate to have. You have to aspire. You can't just sit by the side of the road and watch the years pass by and do nothing. You have to go with it, be a part of it. And I'm glad that I have been, because it's important. You can't throw your life away with nothing. I've been very blessed to have a lot of mentors in my life. Some of them were only, well, I don't mean only friends. Only friends are the best you can have. But some of those mentors were friends that were very, very valuable to me. I have no formula for living a long life. Truthfully, I don't see any benefit in living a long life. The years that I've dwindled away, 102, many other people do the same thing in 75. So I've been wasting a lot of time. I'm grateful for the years I've had, but truthfully, I'm getting to the point where I'm ready to go. I won't regret that at all. What future do you have at 102? That I'm going to live to 105? Oh, so what's the benefit of that? It's 3 more years? Phooey. No, God's blessed me in many ways. And I'm grateful. Mostly, I guess, for the ability He gave me to survive. Because the young life I had was not what I would want to give to my son. And I was really concerned about my marriage because I started my marriage at the same time my father did. He married at age 45. I was 45 when Sally Ann and I married. And she had a health problem. I forget now what the gland was, but her heart would speed up, race away. Then they would medicate it for a while, and then it would get it to slow down, and then it would be too slow, and then you re-medicate it, and then it's out of balance again, and it was up and down, and off and on. And finally, after about 3 years of dealing with that, Sally Ann said to me, I don't think we ought to have children now. I said, whatever you choose is all right with me. And I leaped with joy inwardly when she told me that. Not that I didn't want children, but I have been afraid from the word go that my life, with the limited options that I had lived, would wind up like my father's, and I would be a dependent on my children. And my pride wouldn't allow that. If you're going to have children, you owe them more than that. You owe them more than that. And my father never could provide as he had hoped when he started out his marriage. It's a mixed up issue, really. It has pros and cons, but I wonder what it would be like to have had children, especially at this part of my life. That it would have been a blessing that I know I would have enjoyed. But at the outset, you never know which way things are going to go. She was a real smart, perceptive person. Good guidance, good brains, good practical outlook on things. Smart, really smart.